The first screams could be heard less than 48 hours after the vaccine was injected into their veins. Their skin was turning black, their lymph nodes were swelling to the size of oranges, and they were coughing up the very blood that Dr. Richard Strong took an oath to save. We're taught that the Black Death died out in the Middle Ages. We're told that the men who finally killed it were saints, men like Dr. Richard Strong. He's a Harvard legend, a pioneer of medicine, a hero. But the history books usually skip the morning of 1906, when Richard Strong walked into a crowded prison and injected 24 men with a vaccine that was actually a death sentence. And why, after 13 of them died in absolute agony, did the United States government allow the victims to disappear from the history books forever? In the early 1900s, the world was finally winning the war against infectious disease. Germs had been identified, vaccines were being developed, and medicine was entering what many thought would be its golden age. But in 1906, inside the Bilibid Prison in the Philippines, doctors didn't stop the plague, they caused it. It wasn't a conspiracy that killed these 13 men. They were victims of a medical experiment that changed medicine and ethics forever. They were told they'd be receiving a cholera vaccine. What they received instead was something far more deadly. Within days, the symptoms made it clear that this wasn't cholera at all. High fever, delirium, and swollen lymph nodes signaled a far older enemy, one that many believed modern science had already conquered. The Bubonic Plague had returned, but this time, it arrived in a syringe. Within 72 hours, the infection hit the lymphatic system, and by day 4, the delirium set in. The infection had shattered the men's blood vessels, turning their limbs black while they were still conscious. For 13 of these men, the medicine had become a death sentence, causing their lungs to fill with fluid and their hearts to eventually fail. But as these men were dying in the dark, one man was watching with a clipboard. The man behind the experiment was Dr. Richard Pearson Strong, a well-respected Harvard-educated doctor. He was often considered medicine's golden boy of the era. Dr. Strong was the head of the biological laboratory in Manila, which at the time was controlled by the United States following the Spanish-American War. His job was to study dangerous diseases and develop vaccines that could protect soldiers and eventually civilians. The disease he was working to defeat was cholera, a sickness that kills fast, spreads quickly, and terrified local authorities. Strong believed he could solve it, and like many scientists of the era, he believed progress justified risk, especially when that risk belonged to prisoners. At the time, many doctors believed prison experiments were acceptable. Prisoners were convenient test subjects because if an experiment worked, it could save many people, but if it failed, the prisoners would quietly disappear from history. The prisoners were told they were receiving medicine to protect them from disease. What they were not told was that the vaccine was new and untested. They weren't asked for permission, they were simply injected, and because the prisoners were under government control, they weren't able to say no to doctors. Dr. Strong chose 24 inmates for his experiment, and he injected them, and within 48 hours, his experiment turned into a living nightmare. Strong allegedly believed he was injecting the prisoners with a cholera vaccine prepared in his laboratory. His goal was to observe their reaction and measure whether immunity developed. The process was meant to be controlled and scientific, but instead, it became lethal. Within a few days, the prisoners started to feel very sick. The men developed high fevers, confusion, and painful swelling in their bodies. Dark lumps appeared near their necks and under their arms. These were not the symptoms of cholera. Cholera causes severe diarrhea and dehydration. These men were showing different symptoms that would have been familiar to any medieval physician. Doctors soon realized the truth. These men didn't develop cholera, they had bubonic plague. But by the time the situation was fully understood, 13 of the 24 men were already dead. News of the deaths traveled fast, so fast that the US government was informed and President Theodore Roosevelt himself was notified. The deaths triggered an official investigation to explain what went wrong, but the answer was surprisingly simple. At the time, basic safety rules didn't exist. The labs depended on people being careful, but in this case, someone made a deadly mistake. In Dr. Strong's laboratory, there were samples of different diseases stored closely together. One of those samples contained live plague bacteria. It was later believed that someone accidentally mixed up the plague bacteria with the cholera vaccine. The syringes used on the prisoners were contaminated. Dr. Strong was investigated, but then he was quickly cleared. Despite everything that went wrong, the incident was actually labeled an accident. The deaths were blamed on human error and confusion rather than wrongdoing. And although it acknowledged that the prisoners never consented to the experiment in the first place, that detail carried no real consequences. In fact, no punishment whatsoever followed. No one took responsibility. Despite the body count, Dr. Strong kept his job, his license, and his reputation. Under orders from President Roosevelt, all formal investigations were shut down before they could begin. Instead of a prison cell, Strong received a promotion, eventually becoming the first professor of tropical medicine at Harvard. Some say that Strong was deeply troubled by the incident. He reportedly described it as the worst mistake of his life. Whether that regret was moral or professional is unclear. What is clear, though, is that regret doesn't change the outcome. 13 prisoners were dead. Their names were largely forgotten. Their families received no justice, and their deaths quietly disappeared from medical history. The prisoners who died weren't remembered in official records. But the Bilibid disaster did help push medicine towards more ethical standards, because cases like this accumulated and created more discomfort that can no longer be ignored. So they didn't die in vain. Medicine learned from their deaths, but they died without justice. The system that failed them was never held accountable, and their story is rarely told. The Bilibid prison experiments show how easily medicine can become dangerous when absolute power goes unchecked and human lives are treated as expendable, and serves as yet another reminder that history is sicker than fiction. This isn't legend. This is sick history.